Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. And thank you for being here with us once again tonight, for choosing to slow down, to step away from the noise of the day, and to spend these quiet moments together, listening, resting, and allowing a story to gently carry you towards sleep. We truly appreciate you for returning, for trusting us with this small part of your evening, and for making this shared ritual of calm storytelling a familiar and comforting place to return to night after night. Before we begin the story itself, and before we travel far away from the world you've just left behind, you might want to make yourself a little more comfortable if you can, perhaps lowering the lights in the room, adjusting your pillow, or letting your shoulders relax as you take a slow, deep breath in, and then let it fall away just as slowly. There's no need to focus too hard, no need to follow every detail, because this story isn't meant to be solved or remembered, only listened to, like the sound of rain outside a window, something that can drift in and out of your awareness while your body prepares for rest. Tonight, we're leaving behind cities, schedules, and voices, and we're entering a world where time moves differently, where water and land blur together, and where silence can become both a refuge and a burden. This is the story of a woman who chose a life of almost unimaginable solitude, not for fame or recognition, but because grief and love carried her to a place few people would ever dare to remain. This is the story of Miriam Holt, a woman who lived 19 years completely alone in the Cypress swamps of Louisiana, surviving floods, storms, heat, predators, and the quiet weight of her own thoughts. Part 1. The Atchafalaya Basin, the largest wetland and swamp in the United States, is not merely a landscape but an entire living world, a vast sprawling labyrinth of bayous, towering cypress groves, and dark, slow-moving water, where the boundary between land and river is never fixed and never certain, shifting with the seasons, the rains, and the slow pulse of the earth itself. It is a place of suffocating summer heat and endless humidity, where the air feels heavy enough to press against the chest, and a place of winter floods, when the water rises quietly and steadily, transforming forests into inland seas. This basin is beautiful in a way that is difficult to explain, a beauty that feels ancient and indifferent, and it is also dangerous, filled with snakes, insects, and predators that have ruled these waters long before human footsteps ever reached them. It is a world where sound carries strangely, where silence can feel alive, and where survival depends not on strength alone, but on patience, observation, and respect. It was into this liquid world that Miriam Holt eventually disappeared, but she was not born there, and she did not grow up dreaming of a life among mud, water, and cypress roots. Miriam was a city woman raised among the music, color, and movement of New Orleans, a place filled with voices, dancing, and warm nights lit by street lamps and laughter. She was known as graceful and kind, someone who loved people and conversation, someone who felt at home in crowds and celebration, and nothing in her early life suggested that she would one day choose a path of near-total isolation. In the late 1950s, her life changed when she fell in love with a fisherman named Thomas Holt, a quiet and gentle man whose heart belonged not to the city, but to the swamp itself, a man who knew the Atchafalaya as if it were a living map etched into his memory. Thomas could navigate the winding bayous with an ease that seemed almost instinctive, reading the water, the trees, and the sky as naturally as breathing. And when Miriam married him, she left the city behind and followed him into a world utterly unlike anything she had ever known. They lived together in a small stilt house on the edge of the swamp, lifted above the water and surrounded by silence. And at first, Miriam was afraid of nearly everything: the alligators slipping silently through the water, the snakes hidden among roots and branches, the insects that never seemed to sleep, and the oppressive heat that wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. But slowly, under Thomas's patient guidance, fear gave way to understanding, and understanding gave way to respect, as she learned to fish, to trap, to navigate the bayous, and to recognize the edible plants and medicinal herbs hidden within the swamp. Over time, the swamp stopped feeling like an enemy, and began to feel like a living presence, something powerful and dangerous, but also ordered and meaningful. And Miriam found in it a strange sense of peace, a rhythm that quieted her thoughts and grounded her in the present moment. For nearly 20 years, she and Thomas lived a life that was simple, poor by the standards of the outside world, yet rich in companionship, shared purpose, and a deep connection to the land around them, moving through each day as a team, fully in sync with one another and with the swamp itself. And then, one summer day in 1978, everything ended without warning, when Thomas went out in his boat to check his lines and never returned, caught in a sudden violent storm that swept through the basin with little notice and no mercy. His overturned boat was found days later, empty and drifting, a silent reminder of how quickly the swamp could take back what it had once allowed. Miriam was left alone, her world shattered in an instant, standing at a crossroads between returning to the city she once knew or remaining in the place that held both her deepest happiness and her greatest loss. And in the quiet aftermath of grief, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She stayed. She stayed because the swamp had become her home, because it was where she had loved and been loved, and because somewhere within its shifting waters and silent trees, she believed she might find a way to survive, not only physically, but spiritually as well. And so, in the fall of 1978, with only a small wooden pirogue, a handful of supplies, and a heart heavy with grief, Miriam, remember this story continues slowly, gently deeper into the swamp, and we will follow her there when you're ready to continue. Miriam pushed the pirogue forward into the narrow, winding bayou, the paddle dipping silently into dark water that reflected the sky like a piece of broken glass. And with every slow stroke she moved farther away from the life she had known, and deeper into the heart of the Atchafalaya Basin, a place where few people ever lingered, and even fewer chose to remain. She did not wander aimlessly, because this journey had been forming in her mind for years, ever since she and Thomas had discovered a small hidden rise of land deep within the swamp, an island of firm ground surrounded on all sides by water, cypress knees and tangled roots, accessible only by pirogue and invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. It was a place protected by distance and complexity, shielded by the maze-like nature of the basin itself. And it was here that Miriam intended to build a home, not a house in the way the outside world understood it, but a shelter shaped entirely by necessity, patience, and the logic of the swamp. The work began slowly, deliberately, because in the Atchafalaya nothing could be rushed without consequence, and Miriam understood that survival here depended on careful observation more than brute force. She selected cypress trees for her construction, knowing from years of living alongside Thomas that cypress wood resisted rot and insects better than almost any other tree in the swamp, its dense grain and natural oils allowing it to endure water, heat, and time itself. With a small hand-powered saw and simple tools she had carried with her, she cut the trunks into manageable lengths, resting often, listening to her breath, and learning to measure effort against exhaustion. Using ropes and a system of pulleys she assembled piece by piece, Miriam raised the logs and drove them deep into the soft, yielding ground, creating stilts strong enough to lift her shelter well above the floodwaters that would inevitably come each winter. 10 feet above the earth and water below, she laid a simple platform of cypress planks, knowing that elevation was not a luxury here but a requirement, the difference between life and drowning. The walls of her shack were woven from palmetto fronds, flexible and breathable, allowing air to circulate freely while still offering protection from rain and sun, and the roof was layered thick with Spanish moss, a natural insulator that softened the heat of summer and trapped warmth during cooler months. It was a structure born entirely from the materials around her, shaped not by aesthetics but by adaptation, a quiet dialogue between a woman and the environment she had chosen to inhabit. The heat of the Louisiana swamp was relentless, pressing down day and night, and Miriam quickly realized that shelter alone was not enough, so she devised a cooling system inspired by the swamp itself, gathering thick, black mud from the bayou floor and plastering it onto the exterior walls, creating a dense layer that absorbed the sun's heat, before it could reach the interior. Over this, she layered wet Spanish moss, allowing evaporation to draw warmth away from the structure, a slow, natural process that mirrored the rhythms of the land around her. This small shack, raised on cypress stilts and cooled by mud and moss, became her refuge, her workshop, her sanctuary, and her final boundary between herself and a world that no longer existed for her. Around it stretched the vast Atchafalaya Basin, a living, breathing floodplain covering hundreds of thousands of acres, where summer brought suffocating heat and clouds of mosquitoes. Fall arrived briefly with rust-colored cypress needles and migrating birds, and winter transformed forests into endless quiet water. Here Miriam began a life of near-total self-sufficiency, relying on the swamp for food, medicine, and guidance, fishing for catfish with handmade lines, setting turtle traps woven from willow branches, and gathering edible plants whose locations she memorized as carefully as streets in a city. She learned to move through the swamp with minimal disturbance, to read subtle changes in the water and sky, and to accept the presence of alligators, snakes, and insects not as enemies, but as permanent neighbors in a shared ecosystem. Days passed slowly, marked not by clocks or calendars but by light, hunger, and weather, and nights arrived heavy and dark, filled with the layered sounds of frogs, insects, and distant birds, a chorus that reminded her she was never truly alone, even in isolation. In this silence, Miriam's thoughts grew louder, and memories of Thomas surfaced without warning, drifting through her mind like mist rising from the bayou at dawn, painful yet inseparable from the life she now lived. This was only the beginning of her transformation, the first quiet steps into a life that would test not only her strength and ingenuity, but her sanity, her faith, and her understanding of what it truly meant to survive. And as the seasons turned and the waters rose and fell, Miriam Holt settled into the rhythm of the swamp, unaware of the legend she was slowly becoming. As the first weeks turned into months, Miriam learned that the swamp was not a place that revealed itself all at once, but rather a living system that spoke in small signs and subtle changes, and each morning she woke to a slightly different world, shaped by water levels, wind direction, and the slow migration of animals through the basin. She learned to listen before moving, pausing at the edge of her platform to notice whether the birds were quiet or restless, whether the air felt heavy and still or sharp with the promise of rain, because in the Atchafalaya, these details were not background noise but warnings and invitations woven into daily survival. Food became a rhythm rather than a task, something done patiently and without urgency. As she checked her lines in the bayou, lifting them slowly from the dark water to feel the familiar resistance of catfish, their smooth bodies twisting gently in her hands, before being brought back to the shack. Turtles were trapped and handled with care, their hard shells a reminder of endurance, and frogs were taken only when needed, never more, because Miriam had learned long ago that excess was a form of carelessness. The swamp did not forgive. She cooked simply, over a small, carefully tended fire, using cypress wood chosen for its steady burn and minimal smoke, and she ate in silence, seated on the edge of her platform, watching ripples spread across the water, as insects skimmed the surface and the sun filtered down through the hanging moss. There was no variety in the modern sense, no abundance meant to entertain, but there was consistency, and consistency brought a quiet sense of stability that slowly eased the sharpest edges of her grief. As the seasons shifted, she prepared instinctively, storing dried fish, smoked meat, and gathered roots in woven baskets hung high from the rafters, always mindful of moisture and animals, always thinking weeks ahead rather than days. When fall arrived, brief and gentle, the swamp seemed to exhale, and Miriam used this time to reinforce her shack, tightening lashings, checking stilts, and clearing debris from around her island, knowing that winter rains would come and the water would rise, transforming familiar paths into open water once more. The floods arrived quietly at first, water inching upward day by day, swallowing the forest floor, and creeping closer to her ladder, and Miriam watched without panic, because she had seen this transformation many times before with Thomas. She learned to trust the elevation she had built, to remain still and patient as the basin filled, turning trees into islands and the swamp into a wide brown sea broken only by cypress trunks and drifting debris. During these weeks of isolation, when travel became difficult and the world narrowed to the interior of her shack, time lost its shape, stretching and folding in on itself, and Miriam spent long hours sitting near the fire, mending tools, carving small objects from wood, and writing in her journals, her handwriting slow and deliberate, as if anchoring herself to language itself. She wrote not only about survival but about memory, about Thomas's voice, about moments that returned to her unexpectedly, triggered by a smell, a sound, or the way light fell across the water at dusk. The nights were long, especially during winter floods, when darkness arrived early and lingered, and it was then that the silence grew heavy, pressing inward, filling every corner of her mind. She lay wrapped in a thin blanket, listening to the water lap softly against the stilts below, listening to the distant calls of birds and the deep, slow breathing of the swamp. And sometimes she felt a presence beside her, not real, not imagined exactly, but born from memory and loneliness, a reminder of how deeply the human mind seeks connection. She learned not to fight these moments, not to push them away, but to acknowledge them and let them pass, grounding herself in simple actions, feeding the fire, checking the lashings, counting breaths, because routine became her anchor, in a world where days could otherwise dissolve into each other without distinction. Over time, the solitude began to change her, not suddenly, but gradually, reshaping her thoughts, sharpening her senses, and altering her sense of self, until she no longer felt like a visitor in the swamp, but a permanent part of it. Animals grew accustomed to her presence, watching her from a distance, unafraid but alert, and alligators slipped silently into the water as she paddled past in her pirogue, their eyes tracking her movements without aggression, as if recognizing her as another resident rather than an intruder. Miriam learned their patterns, when to travel, when to stay still, when to make noise and when to remain silent, understanding that coexistence depended on mutual awareness rather than dominance. Slowly, almost without realizing it, the sharp pain of loss softened into something quieter and heavier, a constant companion rather than an open wound, and in that quiet, Miriam found a strange sense of balance, a life stripped of distraction, reduced to essentials, where every action had purpose and every choice carried weight. This was not peace in the way she had once understood it, but it was a form of acceptance, shaped by water, silence, and time. And as the years continued to unfold, the swamp held her, tested her, and transformed her further, preparing her for challenges she could not yet foresee. As the years passed, Miriam's sense of time loosened its grip on her, and days no longer arrived labeled or measured, but simply happened one after another, shaped by light and shadow, hunger and rest, rain and stillness. She no longer counted months or marked anniversaries, because doing so only reopened wounds that the swamp had slowly begun to soften, and instead she learned to live inside the present moment, focusing on what the day required and nothing more. Her body adapted in ways she hadn't anticipated, growing lean and strong from constant movement, her hands toughened by rope, wood, and paddle, her skin darkened by sun and wind until it seemed almost carved rather than worn. She moved differently now, quietly and deliberately, placing her feet with care, listening before stepping, sensing subtle changes in the air that warned her of storms hours before the first cloud appeared. The swamp sharpened her senses the way isolation sharpens a blade, and she came to trust these instincts more than thought itself. There were times when the water rose faster than expected, when heavy rains upstream sent sudden surges through the basin, and Miriam would wake in the night to the sound of rushing water, climbing down her ladder by lantern light to see how close it had come. In those moments, fear returned briefly, sharp and cold, but it never stayed long, because fear required energy, and energy was something she conserved carefully. Instead, she prepared, tying down what she could, moving supplies higher, and then waiting, sitting quietly as the swamp transformed around her. During the highest floods, her world shrank to the dimensions of her shack and the narrow reach of her pirogue, and she traveled less, staying close, watching debris drift past, whole branches and sometimes the silent shapes of animals carried by the current. The water reflected the sky so perfectly that it became difficult to tell where the world ended and began again, and in that mirror-like stillness, Miriam felt as though she was suspended between two realities, neither fully anchored to land nor entirely claimed by water. Isolation pressed hardest during these long stretches, when weeks passed without movement beyond her small island, and it was then that her thoughts grew loud and insistent, replaying conversations from years ago, imagining responses that would never be spoken, reconstructing Thomas's voice so vividly that it sometimes startled her into sitting upright. She understood what was happening, recognized it as the mind's way of filling absence, but understanding did not make it easier, and she learned to meet these moments with patience rather than resistance. She spoke aloud occasionally, not because she believed anyone could hear her, but because hearing her own voice reminded her that she still existed, that she had not dissolved entirely into the swamp. She recited memories, described the weather, named the plants and animals around her, grounding herself in language the way one might grip a rope during a storm. These small acts became rituals, quiet anchors that kept her tethered to herself. As seasons repeated themselves, Miriam began to notice how deeply she had changed, not just in body, but in thought. The world she once knew, the city streets and crowded rooms, felt distant and unreal, like a dream from another lifetime, while the swamp felt immediate, solid and honest. Here nothing pretended to be gentle, and nothing promised safety, but everything followed a logic she could understand, and that clarity brought her a sense of control she had never known before. She learned to read the behavior of animals as carefully as she once read people, noticing when birds fell silent before storms, when insects gathered low near the water, when alligators moved inland ahead of rising floods. These signs reminded her that she was part of a larger system, one that functioned without regard for human grief or memory, yet still allowed her a place within it. At night, lying beneath her moss-covered roof, she listened to the layered sounds of the swamp, the steady chorus of frogs, the distant splash of fish, the soft movement of water against wood, and over time these sounds ceased to feel threatening or lonely. Instead, they became familiar, almost comforting, a reminder that life continued all around her, unseen but persistent. In this way, grief slowly transformed, no longer an open wound but a quiet presence that accompanied her through each day, woven into her routines and reflections. She no longer asked why she had stayed or whether she should have left, because those questions belonged to another version of herself, a woman who no longer existed. The Miriam who lived here now measured life differently, not by years or milestones, but by survival, by balance, and by the quiet knowledge that she had endured. And still, even as she settled deeper into this existence, the swamp continued to test her, sending storms stronger than any she had faced before, moments that would force her to confront just how fragile her sanctuary truly was, and how thin the line remained between reminder and erasure, a line she walked every day without ceremony, without witnesses, and without turning back. One night, as the air grew unnaturally still and the usual chorus of insects faded into an uneasy hush, Miriam sensed change long before the sky confirmed it, because the swamp had taught her to recognize the absence of sound as clearly as its presence. The wind shifted subtly, carrying with it a smell she had come to associate with danger, a metallic heaviness that settled low in her chest, and she moved through her routine without panic, securing loose items, checking lashings, and making sure her pirogue was pulled high and tied fast, her movements calm, deliberate, almost ceremonial. When the storm finally arrived, it did not announce itself gently, but came with sudden force, rain striking the roof in hard, slanted sheets and wind howling through the cypress groves like something alive and searching. Miriam remained inside her shack, sitting close to the fire, listening as the structure responded to the pressure around it. wood creaking, ropes tightening, the stilts shuddering as water surged beneath them. She did not pray in words because words had lost their meaning long ago, but she focused instead on the simple reality of the present moment, the warmth of the fire, the steadiness of her breath, the knowledge that she had built this place with care and understanding. Hours passed indistinctly, time dissolving into sound and motion, and when the storm finally moved on, leaving behind a transformed landscape, Miriam emerged cautiously to survey the damage. Trees lay broken or uprooted, debris hung tangled in branches, and the water stood higher than she had seen it in years, pressing close to the underside of her platform, reminding her how narrow her margin truly was. Yet her shack remained standing, battered but intact, a quiet testament to preparation and patience rather than strength. It was after storms like this that Miriam felt the weight of her isolation most deeply, not in fear, but in the absence of anyone with whom to share survival. No voice to say it had passed, no presence to acknowledge endurance. She would sit afterward, watching clouds drift away and light return slowly to the water, feeling both relief and a strange emptiness, because triumph meant little when there was no one to witness it. Still, she stayed. She stayed through seasons that blurred together, through summers that pressed heat into every movement and winters when the basin flooded so completely that her world became nothing but water and sky. During these times she relied on her journals more than ever, writing by firelight, her words unadorned and honest, recording not only what she did, but what she felt, fears she would never admit aloud, moments when she questioned her resolve, and others when she felt a deep, almost unsettling sense of belonging. Her writing was not polished or meant for anyone else, but it anchored her, giving shape to thoughts that might otherwise spiral inward. And over time these pages became a quiet dialogue between who she had been and who she was becoming. She wrote of Thomas often, not as a wound but as a presence woven into the landscape, remembering how he once laughed at her early fears, how he taught her to read the water, how his absence still echoed in moments of silence. The animals around her continued to accept her as part of their world, watching without hostility, retreating without fear, and Miriam found comfort in this unspoken recognition. Alligators rested on muddy banks as she passed, birds nested near her island, and even snakes, once a source of constant tension, became predictable, manageable, creatures with patterns she respected and avoided. As years accumulated quietly, Miriam no longer thought of herself as surviving, because survival implied an endpoint, a return to something else, and she no longer believed such a return existed for her. This life was not temporary, it was complete in itself, shaped by repetition, adaptation, and a slow surrender to the rhythms of the swamp. Yet beneath this acceptance lingered a quiet awareness that nothing here was permanent. Not her shack, not her body, not even the basin itself, and this knowledge followed her through each day like a shadow, reminding her that endurance was not immunity, only persistence. And so she continued, tending the fire, checking the water, listening to the wind, and waking each morning to a world that asked the same question again and again, whether she was ready to remain, and whether she was prepared when the swamp eventually decided otherwise. There came a point, somewhere deep into those passing years, when Miriam realized that fear no longer arrived suddenly, no longer struck like a sharp edge, but instead appeared quietly, settling beside her like an old companion whose presence she acknowledged without alarm. The swamp had taught her that panic wasted energy and clarity was the one thing she could not afford to lose, so she learned to meet every new challenge with the same measured calm, whether it was a rising wind, a change in watercolor, or an unfamiliar sound moving through the trees at night. Her days followed a pattern so simple it might have seemed empty to anyone else, yet for Miriam it provided structure and meaning, because each task, no matter how small, contributed directly to her continued existence. She woke with the light filtering through moss and leaves, checked the water level beneath her platform, fed the fire, and prepared whatever food the swamp had offered the day before, moving through these actions with a quiet attentiveness that bordered on meditation. Traveling by pirogue remained her connection to the wider basin, and she navigated its narrow channels with an ease that felt almost instinctive now, guiding the boat through tight spaces where roots rose like grasping fingers and fallen branches created shifting obstacles. She read the water's surface the way others read written words, noticing small ripples that signaled movement beneath, darker patches that revealed depth, and subtle currents that could carry her forward or pull her off course if ignored. There were moments when she paused mid-journey, letting the pirogue drift, simply to observe, watching her reflection break apart in the water, listening to the layered sounds around her, and feeling the strange sensation of existing entirely within the present, unburdened by anticipation or regret. In those moments, the world felt complete, contained, as if nothing existed beyond the curve of the bayou and the reach of her paddle. Illness came quietly as well, never dramatic, but always threatening, because even a minor injury or fever could grow dangerous in isolation. When her body weakened, Miriam relied on what she had learned, gathering willow bark for pain, plantain leaves for wounds, and cattail roots to soothe irritation, trusting the swamp's pharmacy with the same respect she gave its dangers. Recovery was slow, requiring patience and restraint, and she learned to rest without guilt, understanding that endurance depended as much on stillness as on effort. At night, the fire remained her anchor, its steady glow pushing back the darkness, just enough to make the interior of her shack feel human, familiar, alive. She fed it carefully, never letting it die completely, because it represented continuity, a fragile thread connecting her to a world of shared knowledge and ancient habit. Watching the flames dance across the walls, she sometimes felt as though time itself had slowed, looping gently, allowing her to exist outside of years and expectations. The silence that once frightened her became layered and expressive, filled with meaning she learned to interpret, and she could tell by sound alone whether the night would remain calm or whether change was approaching. The distant splash of fish, the sudden stillness of insects, the low movement of wind through trees all spoke to her in ways words never could, and listening became second nature, a form of awareness that required no conscious effort. She no longer thought of herself as alone in the way she once had, because loneliness implied absence, and here there was nothing absent, only different. The swamp did not speak, but it responded. And in that response, Miriam found a kind of dialogue, a quiet exchange between herself and the environment that sustained her. Yet even within this balance, she remained aware that the swamp was not a partner, not a protector, but a force that tolerated her presence for as long as conditions allowed. This understanding kept her attentive, humble, and prepared, reminding her each day that survival here was never guaranteed, only negotiated. And so she continued, day after day, season after season, living within this narrow margin between stability and erasure, her life unfolding without witnesses, without record beyond her own journals and memory, while somewhere far away the world continued on, unaware that a woman existed deep within the Atchafalaya Basin, shaped by water, silence, and time, waiting unknowingly for the moment when everything would shift once again. There were mornings when Miriam woke before the light, stirred not by sound but by a feeling, an indistinct awareness that something in the balance of the swamp had shifted during the night, and she would lie still for a long moment, listening, breathing, letting the world reveal itself before she moved. Sometimes it was nothing more than a change in wind or the slow approach of rain, but other times it was the distant echo of movement, a reminder that life here never truly slept, even when it appeared calm. She learned to respect these instincts without questioning them, rising slowly, checking her surroundings, and adjusting her plans without frustration, because the swamp rewarded flexibility and punished stubbornness. If the water was too high, she stayed close. If the heat pressed too hard, she worked early and rested through the worst of the day. If the air grew heavy and still, she prepared for storms before the first cloud ever appeared. This quiet attentiveness became her greatest skill, more valuable than strength or speed. There were stretches when the rain seemed endless, falling day after day until the sky and water blended into a single grey presence. And during those times Miriam's world grew small and inward. She spent hours sitting by the fire, mending nets, sharpening tools, and writing, her pen moving slowly across the page, as if each word required careful permission. She wrote about small things, the way light reflected off floating leaves, the pattern of ripples left behind by passing turtles, the comfort she found in routine, because naming these details helped anchor her in a reality that might otherwise dissolve into sameness. Sometimes, while writing, she paused mid-sentence, struck by the sudden realization that no one would ever read these words, and the thought carried both relief and weight. There was freedom in anonymity, in existing without explanation, but there was also a quiet ache in knowing that her experiences might vanish with her, absorbed back into the swamp without trace. She accepted this possibility without bitterness, understanding that not all lives were meant to be witnessed. As the years layered themselves quietly one upon another, Miriam's memory of the outside world softened at the edges, details blurring, faces fading, streets losing their shape, until New Orleans felt less like a place she had lived and more like a story she had once been told. In contrast, every bend of the bayou, every cluster of cypress knees, every patch of higher ground remained vivid and precise, etched deeply into her awareness. This reversal felt natural rather than unsettling, a sign of where she truly belonged now. There were moments of unexpected beauty that arrived without warning, catching her off guard, like the sight of mist lifting from the water at dawn, or the reflection of a full moon stretched across the bayou like a path made of light. During these moments, she felt something close to gratitude, not directed toward any single force or belief, but toward existence itself, toward the simple fact of being present to witness such scenes. These moments did not erase hardship, but they softened it, offering brief, quiet rewards for endurance. At times, she sensed that the swamp was changing her in ways she could not fully understand, reshaping her thoughts, her reactions, even her sense of identity, until she no longer defined herself by who she had been or what she had lost. Instead, she existed as she was, a woman moving through water and silence, guided by observation and habit rather than expectation. Yet beneath this steady rhythm, there remained an awareness that nothing here was fixed, that storms would return, that water would rise again, and that her careful balance could be disrupted without warning. This knowledge did not frighten her, but it kept her alert, present, and prepared, reinforcing the understanding that survival in the swamp was never permanent, only provisional. And so she continued, waking, working, resting, listening, and waiting, not for rescue, not for recognition, but for the next subtle shift in the air, the next quiet signal from the water, as her life flowed onward, deep within the Atchafalaya, unseen and unrecorded, yet fully lived, moment by moment. There were days when nothing happened at all, at least nothing that could be named or marked, and yet these days were among the most important, because they taught Miriam how to exist without expectation, how to remain present even when the world offered no drama, no challenge, no reward. She would sit for long stretches on the edge of her platform, feet dangling above the water, watching insects trace invisible paths across the surface, feeling the slow passage of time not as something to be endured, but as something to be inhabited. In these quiet hours her thoughts slowed, losing their urgency, no longer demanding answers or resolutions, and instead drifting gently, like leaves carried by a current too subtle to see. She stopped replaying old conversations, stopped imagining different endings, and allowed memory to arise only when it wished, accepting it without resistance, and letting it fade again when it was ready to go. This surrender brought a kind of rest deeper than sleep, a stillness that settled not just in her body but in her mind. The swamp continued to surround her with its steady presence, changing almost imperceptibly from day to day, and Miriam noticed how even familiar places were never quite the same twice. A fallen tree altered a channel's flow, a beaver's work reshaped a shoreline, A season of heavy rain shifted the contours of her island just enough to demand attention. Nothing here remained static, and this constant, gentle transformation mirrored the changes taking place within her, reminding her that survival was not about preserving the past, but about adapting to the present. Sometimes, while paddling slowly through the bayous, she felt as though she were moving not through space but through layers of time, passing scenes that felt ancient, untouched, and enduring. The cypress trees, their trunks thick and scarred, seemed to watch without judgment, witnesses to countless lives that had come and gone long before hers, and would continue long after. In their presence, her own story felt both insignificant and complete, a single thread woven into a vast, indifferent tapestry. At night, when the fire burned low and the world narrowed to shadows and sound, Miriam found herself reflecting not on what she had lost, but on what remained, on the simple fact that she was still here, still breathing, still capable of care and attention. The ache of loneliness did not disappear, but it softened, losing its sharpness, becoming a background hum rather than a constant ache. She learned that sorrow did not need to be overcome or resolved, only carried gently, like everything else in this place. There were moments when she imagined what it would feel like to see another person again, to hear a voice not shaped by memory or imagination, and these thoughts passed through her without longing or fear. She did not reject the idea, but neither did she cling to it, understanding that whatever might happen in the future would arrive in its own time, just as floods and storms did, without regard for desire. The swamp accepted her presence without acknowledgement, offering neither comfort nor cruelty, only consequence, and in this honesty Miriam found clarity. Each day she woke she chose again, not in any dramatic sense, but simply by continuing, by feeding the fire, by checking the water, by listening to the air. These small acts, repeated endlessly, became her declaration, quiet and unwavering. And so her life moved forward, unobserved and unnamed, shaped by routine, awareness and patience, held gently within the shifting boundaries of water and land, as the Atchafalaya breathed around her, waiting, as it always did, for the next change to come. As another season settled quietly over the basin, Miriam noticed how her awareness extended beyond herself, stretching outward into the swamp in ways she could never have imagined before, as if her thoughts no longer stopped at the edges of her body, but moved freely through water, trees, and air. She could sense the approach of weather long before it arrived, not as a prediction but as a subtle shift in pressure and tone, a feeling that something was preparing itself to move. She began to understand that the swamp did not operate in moments, but in cycles, and that patience was not simply waiting, but aligning oneself with these slow, repeating patterns. When the water receded, she worked. When it rose, she stayed still. When the heat pressed down too heavily, she rested. When the air cooled and cleared, she moved again. Nothing felt wasted, because everything belonged to a rhythm larger than her own intentions. Sometimes, as she paddled through narrow channels barely wider than her pirogue, the cypress knees rising around her like silent sentries, she felt an unexpected tenderness toward this place that had taken so much from her and yet given her a way to continue. She did not romanticize the swamp, because it had never pretended to be kind, but she respected it deeply, knowing that it had shaped her not by nurturing her comfort, but by demanding her attention. Her journals grew thinner as time passed, not because her thoughts had emptied, but because she no longer felt the same need to capture them. Experience itself became enough, and words once necessary to hold her together slowly lost their urgency. She still wrote occasionally, especially on long nights when sleep came slowly, but many days passed now without ink touching paper, filled instead with quiet observation and simple presence. The boundary between solitude and peace blurred until it was difficult to say where one ended and the other began. Miriam no longer measured her life against any outside standard, no longer imagined explanations or defenses for her choices. She existed without audience, without comparison, and in that absence she felt lighter, as if something heavy had been set down at last. There were times when she wondered, not with anxiety but with curiosity, how long she could continue like this, how many seasons her body would endure, how many floods would test her shelter, how many storms would pass overhead. These thoughts did not frighten her, because they were not urgent questions, only acknowledgments of impermanence, something the swamp demonstrated daily. At dusk, when the light softened and shadows lengthened across the water, she often paused whatever task she was doing, and simply watched, allowing the day to close around her without resistance. The colors faded slowly, the air cooled, and the swamp exhaled, settling into its night rhythm, and Miriam felt herself settle with it, her breathing slowing, her thoughts quieting, her presence blending seamlessly into the world around her. She no longer felt as though she were hiding from the world, because hiding implied fear, and what she felt now was something closer to alignment, a life pared down to essentials, free of distraction, shaped by attention and care. The swamp did not demand explanations or apologies, and in return she offered it respect, patience, and acceptance. And so the days continued, gentle and demanding in equal measure, carrying Miriam forward without announcement, deeper into a life defined not by isolation, but by awareness, as the Atchafalaya held her within its shifting embrace, waiting, as it always had, for the next quiet transformation to unfold. There were nights when sleep arrived easily, carried in on the steady rhythm of insects and water, and others when it stayed just out of reach, hovering somewhere beyond the edge of her awareness. And during those wakeful hours, Miriam lay still, eyes open in the darkness, listening as the swamp breathed around her. The sounds were never the same twice, yet always familiar, and she learned to trace their patterns the way one might trace constellations, finding comfort in repetition without needing certainty. On those nights, memory surfaced gently, rather than forcefully, drifting into her thoughts like mist rising from warm water, and she allowed it to come without resistance, remembering Thomas not with sharp pain but with a quiet fondness that felt less like loss and more like presence. She remembered his patience, the way he moved through the bayou without haste, the small habits that once felt ordinary and now felt precious, and in these recollections, she found a sense of continuity rather than absence. The swamp, indifferent to memory, continued its own cycles, and Miriam noticed how storms seemed to arrive with less warning now, how the weather shifted more abruptly than it once had, forcing her to remain vigilant even during times that once felt predictable. She adapted without complaint, reinforcing her shelter, checking her lashings more often, and adjusting her routines as needed, because adaptation had long since replaced resistance as her primary response to change. There were moments when she felt a quiet curiosity about the world beyond the basin, wondering what had changed, what had disappeared, what had replaced the life she once knew. But these thoughts remained abstract, lacking the pull they once might have carried. Distance had softened their edges, and the outside world felt less like something she had lost, and more like something that had simply moved on without her, just as she had moved on without it. Her connection to the swamp deepened in subtle ways, and she began to anticipate its movements not through conscious thought, but through sensation, a slight tightening in her chest before rain, a restless energy before storms, a heaviness in the air before floods. These signals guided her more reliably than any calendar or forecast, and she trusted them completely because they had never betrayed her. At times she imagined how she might appear to an outsider, if anyone ever found her here, weathered, quiet, moving through the swamp with a familiarity that bordered on instinct, and the thought felt strangely distant, almost irrelevant. She no longer defined herself through the eyes of others, and the idea of being observed held neither appeal nor fear. Her life continued in this narrow, deliberate balance, sustained by routine, awareness, and acceptance. And though each day resembled the last, none felt wasted or empty. In their sameness she found depth, and in their quiet repetition she found stability, a form of peace that did not depend on comfort, but on understanding. And so the swamp carried her onward, night after night, season after season, holding her within its shifting boundaries, as Miriam moved deeper into a life shaped not by isolation, but by an ever-growing attentiveness to the world as it was. moment by moment waiting without urgency for whatever change might come next. As the nights grew warmer again, and the air thickened with moisture, Miriam noticed how her breathing had unconsciously aligned itself with the swamp, slowing when the world was still, quickening only when movement or danger required it, as if her body no longer belonged solely to her, but followed the same invisible rules as the water and wind. She trusted this change, because it had kept her alive, and because resisting it would have meant clinging to a version of herself that no longer existed. Some evenings she sat at the edge of her platform until the last light faded completely, watching the surface of the bayou turn from reflective silver to deep black, feeling the subtle shift as night took full possession of the basin. In those moments she felt suspended between worlds, neither fully awake nor asleep, existing in a gentle threshold where thought softened and sensation took its place. She became acutely aware of how little she truly needed, how few objects surrounded her, how simple her movements had become, and instead of feeling deprived, she felt unburdened. Each tool had a purpose, each action a reason, and nothing existed merely to distract or entertain. This clarity brought with it a quiet satisfaction, a sense that her life, though small in scale, was complete in its own way. There were times when the swamp tested her patience rather than her strength, when days of relentless heat made even the simplest tasks feel heavy, and during those periods she learned the value of stillness. She rested without guilt, conserving energy, allowing the heat to pass rather than fighting against it, because the swamp rewarded those who knew when not to act. Her thoughts during these slow days drifted toward questions she never expected to ask, not about purpose or meaning in the abstract, but about presence, about what it meant simply to exist without witnesses, without milestones, without a future planned beyond the next change in weather. She did not answer these questions directly, but allowed them to remain open, understanding that not all questions were meant to be resolved. Occasionally she felt a subtle sense of being observed, not in a threatening way, but as though the swamp itself were aware of her continued presence, watching without judgment, indifferent yet attentive. This feeling did not frighten her because she had long accepted that she was no longer separate from this place, but woven into its patterns, subject to its rules, and sustained by its rhythms. The fire remained her constant, its glow softening the edges of darkness, its warmth grounding her in the present, and she tended it with care, understanding that its survival mirrored her own. As long as it burned, there was continuity, a quiet acknowledgement that she remained part of a long human tradition, even in isolation. And so Miriam continued, living within the narrow space between endurance and acceptance, her days shaped by attention rather than ambition, her nights held gently by sound and shadow, as the Atchafalaya Basin shifted endlessly around her, carrying her forward without ceremony, without promise, and without end, waiting patiently for the next moment to unfold. As the nights grew warm again, and moisture settled thickly into the air, Miriam began to notice that her breathing no longer followed conscious thought, but instead adjusted itself naturally to the pace of the swamp, slowing when the world was still, and quickening only when movement or danger required it, as though her body had learned to obey the same quiet rules that guided the water, the wind, and the trees. In the evenings she often remained at the edge of her platform until the final trace of daylight faded, watching the bayou lose its soft reflections and darken into a smooth, shadowed surface, feeling the subtle moment when day surrendered to night, and the entire landscape seemed to settle into a deeper, heavier calm, suspended somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. Her life had become remarkably spare, not through deprivation but through clarity, and the few objects that surrounded her no longer felt limiting, but freeing because each one served a clear purpose. Each movement had meaning, and nothing existed simply to distract or fill empty time. There were periods when the swamp tested her patience rather than her strength, long stretches of oppressive heat when even simple tasks felt unnecessary, and during those times Miriam learned the discipline of stillness, allowing herself to rest without guilt, conserving energy, and waiting for the world to shift. knowing that true endurance here meant knowing when not to act. The thoughts that drifted through her mind on those slow days were no longer questions of destiny or explanation, but quieter reflections on what it meant to exist without witnesses, without external markers, and without a future defined beyond the next change in weather. And she did not seek to resolve these thoughts, understanding that some questions were meant to remain open. At times she felt a faint sense of being noticed, not by another person, but by the swamp itself, aware of her continued presence without judgment or intent. And this awareness did not unsettle her, because she had long accepted that she was no longer separate from this place, but woven into its rhythms, bound by its conditions, and sustained by its balance. The fire remained her point of steadiness, its quiet glow softening the edges of darkness, and turning the interior of her shelter into something recognizable and human. And the care with which she tended it had become instinctive, because as long as the flame endured, there was continuity, warmth, and a fragile link to the long human habit of gathering around light. And so Miriam continued, living within a narrow space between endurance and acceptance, her days shaped by attention rather than ambition, her nights held gently by sound and shadow, as the Atchafalaya Basin shifted endlessly around her, carrying her forward without urgency, without promise, and without any clear conclusion yet in sight. As the days followed one another in quiet succession, Miriam found that her sense of self had softened, as if the sharp outlines that once defined her thoughts and reactions had gradually been worn smooth by water and time. She no longer felt the need to name each feeling or examine it closely, because emotions now passed through her the way weather passed through the basin, arriving, lingering, and then moving on without demanding explanation. There were mornings when she woke to a pale, filtered light slipping through the moss and palmetto walls, the air already warm and heavy, and she lay still for a while, listening to the swamp come alive, letting the sounds assemble themselves before she rose. The first splash of a fish, the distant call of a bird, the soft movement of water against wood, all reached her in layers, and in those moments she felt fully present, anchored not by thought but by awareness. She moved through her routines without hurry, feeding the fire, checking her supplies, scanning the waterline beneath her platform, each action performed with the same quiet care, because here even small neglect could grow into danger. Yet these tasks no longer felt burdensome, because repetition had stripped them of effort, turning them into something closer to ritual than labor. Sometimes, as she paddled slowly through the bayous, Miriam felt as though she were drifting through a place outside ordinary time, where nothing urged her forward and nothing pulled her back. The narrow channels curved gently ahead, framed by cypress trunks and hanging moss, and she followed them without destination, trusting the movement itself rather than any particular goal. The world beyond the swamp felt increasingly abstract, not forgotten, but distant, like a story whose details had faded with retelling, and she no longer wondered whether she might return to it. That question had lost its urgency, replaced by a simpler awareness of where she was and what was required of her in each moment. As evening settled in and the light thinned, she returned to her island, securing the pirogue and climbing back into the familiar enclosure of her shelter. The fire flickered softly, casting slow shadows along the walls, and Miriam sat quietly beside it, allowing the day to dissolve without commentary or judgment. In this stillness, she felt neither triumph nor defeat, only continuity, a steady unfolding of life shaped by attention and patience rather than desire. And as night wrapped itself around the basin once more, the swamp held her as it always had, indifferent yet encompassing, while her story continued onward, quietly, without witnesses, and without any need to announce what might come next. As the basin settled into another long cycle of warmth and rain, Miriam noticed that even her memories had begun to change their shape, no longer arriving as sharp images or sudden emotions, but as soft impressions like reflections on moving water that could never be fully grasped. They passed through her without resistance now, neither welcomed nor pushed away, simply allowed, and in this letting go she felt lighter, less bound to who she had once been. Her awareness of danger became quieter but more precise, and she no longer reacted with tension when something unfamiliar entered the swamp, because unfamiliarity itself had become ordinary. A sudden splash at night, the rustle of movement near the waterline, the slow approach of a storm carried on a shift in air pressure, all registered calmly within her, processed without urgency, because panic had long ago been replaced by preparation. She continued to move through her days with deliberate economy, conserving energy, choosing each action with care, knowing that endurance here was not built on effort alone, but on restraint. There were hours when she did nothing at all, sitting quietly with her back against the wall of her shelter, eyes half closed, listening as the swamp rearranged itself around her, and these hours felt as necessary as any work she did. During floods, when the water rose high enough to erase familiar landmarks, Miriam adapted without ceremony, shifting her routines inward, traveling less, relying more heavily on what she had stored and prepared in advance. The world outside her platform transformed into a broad, silent expanse, broken only by tree trunks and drifting debris, and in that altered landscape she felt no sense of loss, only recognition that change was the natural state of this place. At night, when darkness pressed close and the sounds of the swamp intensified, she sometimes spoke softly to herself, not in conversation but in acknowledgement, naming the things she could hear, the movements she sensed, grounding herself in presence. Her voice sounded different to her now, lower, steadier, shaped by long silence, and hearing it reminded her that she still belonged to the human world, even as she lived far beyond it. The fire continued to burn low and steady, its light catching on the edges of familiar objects, turning shadows into shapes she recognized without fear. She fed it carefully, respecting its limits, understanding that excess here could be as dangerous as neglect. The flame remained a quiet constant, marking the passage of evening into night without ever demanding attention. As sleep finally came, it arrived gently, not as escape, but as continuation, her body resting while the swamp remained awake, moving, breathing, and reshaping itself beyond her walls. And when she woke again, as she always did, to another filtered morning light, and the layered sounds of water and life, Miriam rose without hesitation, stepping once more into the slow, attentive rhythm that carried her forward, deeper into the basin, where her days continued to unfold without conclusion, guided only by awareness, patience, and the quiet persistence of living. When morning returned, it did so quietly, filtering through the hanging moss and thin walls of the shelter, and Miriam woke not with urgency, but with a gradual awareness. As if consciousness itself rose alongside the light, she listened first, as she always did, allowing the swamp to announce the day in its own language, the subtle shift of water against wood, the distant calls of birds, the low, continuous hum of insects that never truly slept. She remained still for a while, feeling the firmness of the platform beneath her, noticing the temperature of the air against her skin, and only when she sensed that nothing demanded immediate attention did she rise and move toward the small tasks that shaped her mornings. The fire was coaxed back to life if it had faded too low, supplies were checked with practiced hands, and the waterline beneath the shelter was observed carefully, because even a small change could signal something larger approaching. As she stepped into the pirogue and pushed off gently, the surface of the bayou parted without sound, closing again behind her as though she had never passed through at all. The paddle moved slowly, evenly, each stroke measured and familiar, and Miriam let herself drift where the channel guided her, no longer needing a destination beyond the act of moving itself. She noticed how the light shifted as clouds passed overhead, how shadows stretched and contracted, and how the swamp seemed to rearrange itself continuously, even when it appeared still. There were moments when she paused, letting the boat rest against a cluster of roots, simply observing the world around her, aware that these pauses were not interruptions but an essential part of her rhythm. In those moments she felt neither urgency nor boredom, only a steady presence, a sense of existing fully within the narrow boundaries of now. By midday the heat pressed down heavily, and Miriam returned to her island, understanding without frustration that the swamp dictated when movement was wise and when it was not. She rested, drank water sparingly, and waited, trusting that the world would open again when the balance shifted. This patience was not passive, but attentive, a readiness held quietly rather than expressed through action. As evening approached, the air softened, and the swamp seemed to loosen its grip, allowing movement once more. Miriam prepared her meal, simple and unadorned, and ate without distraction, aware of each motion, each sound, each sensation, because here even eating was part of survival's rhythm. When darkness settled in fully, she returned to the familiar circle of firelight, letting the day recede without reflection or judgment. The night gathered around her, filled with layered sound and unseen movement, and Miriam accepted it as she accepted everything else in this place, without resistance, without expectation. And so the cycle continued, day flowing into night and night into day, each moment carrying the next without announcement, as Miriam remained within the slow, deliberate rhythm of the Atchafalaya Basin, living quietly, attentively, and completely, while her story moved onward, still unfolding, still unfinished, waiting for whatever change might come. Over time, Miriam came to understand that the swamp did not distinguish between ordinary days and significant ones, because every day carried the same potential for change, and so she treated each morning with equal care, never assuming safety, never anticipating danger, but remaining open and attentive to whatever the basin chose to reveal. This way of living eased her mind, because expectation had once been a source of anxiety, and now it no longer served her. There were afternoons when clouds gathered slowly overhead, piling upon one another without urgency, and Miriam watched them without concern, noting their height, their color, the way the air shifted beneath them. Sometimes they passed without rain, dissolving back into brightness, and other times they released sudden downpours that drummed against her roof and sent ripples racing across the water below. In either case, she adapted quietly, adjusting her plans without frustration, understanding that resistance here wasted energy better saved for true necessity. She grew deeply familiar with her own limits, knowing when her body needed rest and when it could be pushed a little further, and this knowledge became a form of trust, replacing doubt with clarity. Pain was no longer alarming, only informative, a signal to slow down, to change direction, or to pause entirely. In listening to these signals, she avoided injury and exhaustion, preserving herself not through strength, but through awareness. The swamp continued to surround her with its constant presence, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply existing as it always had, and Miriam found comfort in that neutrality. There were no expectations placed upon her here, no roles to fulfill, no version of herself she was required to maintain. She could exist exactly as she was, shaped by circumstance rather than judgment, and this freedom, though quiet, felt profound. Sometimes, while sitting alone in the evening, she reflected on how completely her life had narrowed, and how, in that narrowing, it had gained depth. What once felt like limitation now felt like focus, as though everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only what truly mattered. This realization did not arrive as an insight or revelation, but as a gradual settling, a gentle alignment with the life she was living. As darkness returned and the swamp's nocturnal rhythm resumed, Miriam settled once more into stillness, listening, breathing, and allowing the day to dissolve without commentary. The fire glowed softly, the water moved quietly beneath her, and the world continued its slow, unbroken motion around her. And within that motion Miriam remained, attentive and steady, living each moment as it arrived, neither reaching ahead nor looking back, as her days continued to unfold deep within the Atchafalaya Basin, without urgency, without witnesses, and without an ending yet in sight. There were evenings when the air cooled just enough to carry the faint scent of damp earth and leaves, and Miriam sensed these changes with a familiarity that felt almost instinctive, as though her body had learned to recognize the swamp's moods before her thoughts could catch up. She adjusted her movements accordingly, finishing tasks earlier, settling in sooner, allowing the day to fade without resistance. She noticed how darkness arrived differently depending on the season, sometimes slipping in slowly, almost gently, and other times falling all at once, dense and complete, and she learned to accept both without preference. Light and shadow were no longer opposites to her, but parts of the same rhythm, each necessary, each carrying its own quiet purpose. In moments of stillness, she felt the subtle ache of effort in her muscles, not as pain but as evidence of living, a reminder that her body remained capable, responsive, and present. She stretched carefully, moved slowly, and respected these sensations, knowing that endurance here was built on listening rather than ignoring. The swamp continued to offer its lessons without instruction, teaching her through repetition and consequence, and Miriam absorbed these lessons without naming them. She no longer thought in terms of mastery or control, because those ideas belonged to a world that measured success differently. Here, survival was not an achievement, but a condition maintained through attentiveness and restraint. There were times when she felt a quiet gratitude for the simplicity of her days, for the absence of choices that once overwhelmed her, and this gratitude did not feel dramatic or emotional, but steady and grounded, like the knowledge of firm earth beneath water. She did not compare her life to any other, because comparison required distance, and distance no longer existed for her. As night deepened and the swamp's layered sounds rose around her, Miriam allowed herself to rest fully, trusting that the world would continue its slow movement whether she watched or slept. The fire dimmed but did not disappear. The water shifted softly below, and the air settled into a familiar weight. And so she remained, moving with the basin rather than against it, shaped by repetition, awareness, and quiet endurance, her life continuing moment by moment within the vast breathing landscape of the Atchafalaya, still unfolding, still present, and still without any final boundary in sight. With time, Miriam stopped thinking of her days as separate from one another, because each sunrise seemed to rise out of the last, and each night folded gently back into the next, creating a sense of continuity that made beginnings and endings feel less important than presence itself. She no longer woke with plans in her mind, but with awareness, allowing the conditions of the morning to shape what would follow, trusting that the swamp would guide her decisions better than intention ever could. There were moments when she sensed movement far beyond her line of sight, subtle disturbances in the water or the faint shift of air through the trees, and she learned to read these signals without anxiety, understanding that not everything required action. Often, simply observing was enough, because knowledge here was not gathered through intervention but through patience and restraint. As the light climbed higher, she moved only when the heat allowed it, performing her tasks in measured intervals, pausing often, conserving strength and listening closely to her own body. Hunger arrived quietly and was met without excess. Thirst was quenched carefully, and rest was taken whenever it was needed, because survival here depended not on pushing limits, but on respecting them. Sometimes she caught her reflection in the water, fragmented by ripples and shadow, and she barely recognized the woman looking back, not because she felt lost, but because identity itself had softened, becoming less about appearance and history, and more about action and awareness. She did not linger on these moments, letting the image dissolve as easily as it had formed. The world beyond the basin felt increasingly irrelevant, not in a dismissive way, but as something that belonged to another rhythm entirely, one that no longer intersected with her own. News, events, and distant lives continued somewhere beyond the trees and water, but they no longer pressed against her thoughts or demanded her attention. Here, nothing arrived urgently, and nothing was postponed unnecessarily. As evening returned, Miriam settled once more into the familiar stillness of her shelter, tending the fire with careful hands and allowing the day to release its hold on her without reflection. The swamp gathered itself around her, its sounds deepening, its movements slowing, and she felt herself drawn gently into that same quiet descent. And so her life continued, shaped not by intention or resistance, but by alignment, each moment unfolding naturally from the last. As Miriam remained within the slow breathing rhythm of the Atchafalaya Basin, attentive, present, and enduring, while the story of her solitude carried on, still moving forward, still unfinished, and waiting calmly for whatever might come next. There were days when the swamp seemed almost motionless, the water lying flat and dark beneath a pale sky, and on those days Miriam felt as though the world itself were holding its breath. She moved carefully through these hours, aware that stillness here was never emptiness, but a pause filled with potential, a moment when everything waited without revealing what would come next. She learned to appreciate these quiet stretches, because they allowed her to sense the smallest details, the slight tremor of water caused by something unseen below the surface, the distant flutter of wings passing overhead, the subtle shift in temperature that hinted at a change long before it arrived. In noticing these things, she felt connected not just to her surroundings, but to time itself, moving at a pace far slower than human urgency. Her routines remained simple and deliberate, shaped by habit and necessity rather than thought, and she found comfort in their predictability. Each action flowed into the next without decision or doubt, as if her body remembered what needed to be done even when her mind remained quiet. This ease allowed her to conserve energy not just physically but mentally, freeing her from the constant evaluation that once defined her life. There were moments when exhaustion crept in unexpectedly, a heavy weariness that settled deep in her bones, and Miriam met it without frustration, understanding that rest was not a failure, but a form of wisdom. She lay still when needed, listening to the slow passage of sound and light, allowing her strength to return gradually, without forcing it. As the seasons continued their slow rotation, she noticed how familiar places subtly changed, how waterlines shifted, how vegetation thickened or thinned, how paths once open became closed, and others emerged in their place. Rather than resisting these changes, she adapted to them, understanding that permanence was an illusion here, and that survival depended on flexibility rather than attachment. At night, when the fire burned low and the world narrowed once again, Miriam found herself sinking easily into sleep, carried by the steady chorus of the swamp. Dreams came and went without urgency, sometimes vivid, sometimes absent altogether, and she accepted them without interpretation, allowing rest to remain simply rest. And when morning returned, as it always did, filtered and quiet, she rose without hesitation, stepping once more into the unbroken rhythm that guided her days, as her life continued quietly within the vast, breathing landscape of the Atchafalaya, unfolding moment by moment, without declaration, without witnesses, and without an ending yet revealed. In the spring of 1997, after nearly 19 years of silence, the Atchafalaya Basin revealed a small trace of the woman it had held so carefully. Two fishermen, a father and his son, drifting through a remote stretch of water few people ever entered, noticed something that did not belong to the swamp's endless repetition: a narrow ladder rising from the water, a structure woven from palmetto and moss, standing quietly among the cypress trees. They approached slowly, unsure of what they were seeing, calling out softly, their voices sounding strange and intrusive in a place that had known only wind and water for so long. There was no answer. Inside the small shelter they found no sign of struggle, no disorder, only absence, a cold fire pit, neatly arranged tools, and a single handwritten note resting on a rough wooden surface. Its words simple and final: "The water is rising." There was no trace of Miriam Holt beyond that, no footprints leading away, no boat tied nearby, no body ever found. The swamp, which gives and takes without explanation, had closed around her once more, erasing the last visible outline of her presence, just as it had erased so many lives before. Some believed she had paddled away into deeper water, choosing the moment herself, guided by the same instincts that had sustained her for so long. Others believed the swamp had finally reclaimed her, gently and without struggle, as it does with all things in time. And some believed she had simply become part of the basin, no longer separate enough to be found. Her shelter remained for a while, weathered and slowly surrendering to moss, water, and decay, a quiet testament to a life lived entirely on its own terms. Fishermen spoke of her in hushed tones, leaving small offerings when they passed nearby, not out of fear, but out of respect, calling her the swamp woman, the one who stayed. And perhaps that is all that needs to be known, that for 19 years, a woman lived quietly among water and trees, learning to listen instead of speak, to adapt instead of resist, to endure without being seen, that she found a way to exist beyond the noise of the world, beyond time as most people understand it, and that when her story ended, it did so without spectacle, without witnesses, and without explanation. Now, as the swamp continues to breathe and shift beneath the moonlight, the water still moves through the cypress roots, the insects still sing their endless song, and the Atchafalaya remains what it has always been, vast, indifferent, and alive. And somewhere within that slow, eternal rhythm, the memory of Miriam Holt drifts quietly, like mist over dark water, present, unseen, and at peace. And as you rest now, letting this story fade gently into the background, you can allow the same quiet to settle around you, knowing that nothing more is required tonight. No answers, no effort, only rest as the world continues its slow, patient turning, and sleep arrives in its own time.